We'll begin. Hi, everybody. Welcome to this Habatat-Zoom. We'll be visiting with Kathleen Mulcahy via the internet and experiencing a talk by her, which I'm really looking forward to. She put together an impressive video about her and her work, which we'll be sharing first. It's a little over 6 minutes. But before we get to that, I am going to go through a little housekeeping about what's going on at the gallery and the events that we have that you're all invited to. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. I'm taking over yours. Kathleen, welcome today. Click on this button here. So we have started sending out the formal invitations for Habatat's 50th exhibition, which is in September 9th, 10th, and 11th. If you haven't requested your invitation, please do, because you're welcome to come. It's going to be a spectacular event, 3 days. It's very similar in process to our internationals. Without the grand opening at the end, we're having a special VIP dinner. It's spectacular. There's going to be demonstrations by Richard Jolly, talks by multiple artists, visiting the Flint Institute of Arts, doing our first ever scavenger hunt there. A very special dinner at the end with William Wormus hosting Ferdinand Hampson, talking about the history of studio glass. So make sure you're a part of it. Here's a glimpse at the invitation you'll get in the mail. These also include a handwritten note by me. So make sure to request yours today. It's a spectacular event we're putting a lot of effort into, and hope you consider coming. We're also opening the Habatat Vault for the first time with a formal opening, which is our large back room we've recently put together. Lots of treasures in the back room to come explore and see. So make sure you plan to come. Around the same time, we're opening up a virtual art fair, Glass Art Fair, partnering with them for a lot of the artists that couldn't send artwork in or couldn't make it in. So they'll be opened also for people who can't come into the show to see works that are available for purchase. And we'll do a preview of that when we get closer. These Zooms will continue. We have lots of great experiences planned. Next week, we're going to be visiting with Latchazar Boyajev and Charles Shepard, visiting the Fort Wayne Museum of Art as Latchazar has an exhibition opening. That'll be a lot of fun to tour that virtually and see both of those great people. Here's Latchazar's little promo for his, which is opening up July 24th. And we're going to be visiting John Miller in the Flint Institute of Art. During our event here, you'll see his show, Blue Plate Special, and Steve Lynn is opening up an exhibition there later the year, September 11th, right during our event, and we're going to zoom over to him and take a tour of the space and say hi to him and Charles as well. Okay, so I'm going to make sure I can share my audio with this, and we're going to play this video Kathleen made. Enjoy.
It was sometime in 2003, 2004. We were canoeing the West Branch of the Susquehanna. It's a group of women that I go on a journey with every year. The minute I get on that river and I start to float, everything feels so good. You know, you just feel like you've left everything behind. There was a moment where a storm kicked up pretty quickly, and it was coming straight toward us, and we couldn't get to either side, and we had to just simply let go and just go through this storm. And the storm came and then moved behind, and all of a sudden I realized everything felt different. The air smelled fresh and new. It was so clear. And I put my hand in the water and just for a moment thought, what will my new work look like because of this? How do I create that feeling of the riverbed, the browns, the orange, the warm tones that are right underneath and sort of rippling over the rocks, and how do I get that ripple in the glass, and how do I make that happen above, and then have the drops of rain come down from that? What if I lay them over a bed of metal pins and let the glass just gently sort of relax over the pins and create this kind of movement, but this gentle movement? Because the West Branch particularly is very wide and flat and very easy. So it has that flow to it. In the beginning, the work was very dark because I was really thinking about that riverbed and how to make it that deep. But then Ron and I were near the ocean at some point. And I remember looking out at the water and seeing this kind of silvery light. It was magnificent. You know, it just lit up the whole sky, the whole area. And I thought, well, I wonder if I could create that by using something like stainless steel and working with the steel to create patterns in the background that are almost like mists. And then from there, the drops. Making the drops as many as I could so that I had a range of drops to compose with. For me, the composition is real important. It has to have a kind of almost a sound that I feel internally as I put one drop next to the next and next to the next. Even though I'm making such large, I like to think of them as canvases, the drop is such a simple form. To me, it's the primal form. It is the form that glass makes before any other form. It is the drop. How you hold that drop and, well, keep it from falling to the floor or, you know, not moving enough. That's the moment in the hot shop where I'm playing with that form and letting it just be. That's one of the things that pulls me into this work and keeps me going, is that for me, there is a change in every work. Now the movement is internal, it's inside, and it's a space that I'm moving into and holding on to and feeling as I'm laying or holding that one drop against the next and the next. Such a simple drop, and yet it holds so much emotion. In some ways, kind of like the relationship between the women on the river, or the relationship with other people in real life and how we stand next to them or close to them or far, what the distance is in memory, what the distance is in emotion. And I also think about it as a kind of a mapping of relationships and holding in some ways to this what seems like a small piece of ground, you know, in the work. And yet it has this kind of worldly dimensional feeling to it as you pause to look at it. And when I think about that word, pause, I think that's what happened on the river, and that's what happens in the work. This kind of sense of how can we stop or slow down the moment and make that small place powerful. Yeah, that's where I am.
Very, very exciting. Very, very well done. Compliments to you, Kathleen, for creating that. Gives us a glimpse into what you were doing. And I've always learned from that idea of the shore and how it got brighter and brighter via your experience. So very exciting. Well, I'll invite you to say hello to everybody. I'm going to skip to the next slide and welcome you to this event, and I will run the PowerPoint for you for sure. So when you want me to switch slides, just say, I guess next would work.
Sure.
You know,
Thank you. Thanks,
way
Aaron.
of doing it. No problem.
Yeah, I'd really like that woman on the screen to tell the story to everybody. I haven't given a talk in quite some time, so forgive me if I'm a bit choppy. Aaron will get out the hook if I go too long. First slide, I'd like to say, before I met Ron, I studied at Kean University in New Jersey, not far from where I grew up in Newark, New Jersey. My dad was in law enforcement. My mom was a secretary. Dad owned a toy store, but really just for a short time before the big box stores came in. After he returned from World War II, he was a volunteer in World War II to run the communication lines ahead of the troops, just him and two other guys. My dad was a pretty amazing man and a role model for me. I wanted to be like him. I kept my own last name to honor him. He couldn't make a go of that little toy store, but I can only imagine their struggle to make a life for us. But they did whatever was necessary. And before too long, we had a place by the sea. And my aunt actually took me to art classes when we wintered in New Jersey at age 5, when I started that. From the time I was very tiny, all I could think of was drawing and looking at the surroundings around me and trying to put that on paper somehow. My first day at Kean University, I saw a small box outside the ceramic studio with a flame coming out of it. And that is exactly where I wanted to go. I loved it. I was hooked, though the annealer we had was not good. And every work, almost every work checked. I still loved it. I had that kind of perseverance. The instructor put me in charge of going out to get refractory materials and bringing back bricks and mortar in my tiny, almost broken Volkswagen. And before I met Ron too, I studied at Alfred University with Andy Belisi and Eric Hilton. It was a life-altering experience. The first day, Andy came up to me and said, "Wouldn't it be easier if you held the tools this way?" I learned so much starting from scratch. Then I had my first teaching position at Bowling Green State University with a tiny furnace that was also falling apart, and they were melting bottle glass, Coke bottles with flux. Labino, who was a consultant at the school and probably was not very keen at hiring me, insisted that I couldn't possibly lift a pipe, and I had to show him, and he kept adding weight to it. What a strange experience. But then I heard years later, he actually brought a niece in to run his studio. So I think that's kind of interesting. I was recruited by Carnegie Mellon in 1996. The studio there was falling apart, and they were melting bottle glass. And they had 22 male professors and 1 female professor. That also sounds really odd now. But as the groundbreaker, the one who came from the one who laid the communication lines ahead of the troops, it was the only thing I wanted to do. With the advice of Dale Chihuly, whom I met when he visited Alfred for a lecture, we became friends. He gave me his kiln builder contacts. Bob Barber came for a visit. We developed plans to build a new studio for creative glass, thinking outside the box. Where everyone at that time was teaching students how to make a bowl, I asked my students what they wanted to make, and then I helped them figure it out. There was no budget, so I proceeded to secure donations from Coeur in Kentucky, Johns Mansville in Ohio, AP Green in New Jersey, and there were tools, these tools that I had learned in undergraduate school. Ron came in to help me build, and we shared a life from that moment on. He was a graduate student in 1977. He came back as an older student with a career in clay. He had gotten recognition in Ohio. His work was in the Cleveland Museum of Art. He wanted to study with Ed Eberly, and who is also a well-known ceramic artist, making unique sculptures of a personal and mythical narrative.
Kathleen, I want to jump in here, make sure I'm staying on the same slide for you. You want me to switch it off? Okay,
right here until.
Okay.
So I had this amazing man and partner in my life. His work and my work, we were very different, strong beliefs and opinions, but we were also each other's best advocate. Next slide. I had a grant through the Fulbright to visit Lino Tagliapietra as he worked at Effitre. He didn't own the factory. I actually thought he did because he was directing everything there. But it was quite a unique experience. It was a 3-month visit where I could watch him every day making the most unique lamps. And I'm sure part of those techniques inspired me. Next. We came back and we decided to make a life in Pittsburgh. We bought 8 acres of land outside Pittsburgh, about 19 miles. And since Ron couldn't get a job at the university, they didn't think like that then, being one of 2 women hired. He decided to make his life by building a house from scratch, no electric there, no sewage, nothing. So he started with the house, moved to the studios, moved to outbuildings. Next slide. Ron was asked to set up an installation at the mattress factory in Pittsburgh, which at the time was just a simple place to have exhibitions from local artists. And Barbara Luderowski saw his work. He took over the entire floor and she said, Ron, leave that up. I'm going to write grants and turn this into an international organization, which she did. Next slide. His work moved from the floor to the wall, and he made paintings of a personal narrative. Next slide. My work at the time was vapors. This is a 7-piece installation, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about where it came from. I was reading Foucault's Pendulum, and in it, I found this passage about halfway through. Creation is a process of divine inhalation and exhalation, like anxious breathing or the action of bellows. God blows the world as you would blow a glass bubble. And to do that, he takes a deep breath and holds it, and then emits a long, luminous hiss. God hissed, and there was light. The lights must be gathered in vessels that can contain their splendor without shattering. I closed that book and asked myself, what could those containers look like? Next slide. I was also inspired by a drawing of Paul Klee titled Double Top. So the metal form is a direct take of that from Paul Klee's pedagogical notebooks, where he draws this double top form, but I dreamed the forms inside. Next slide. When I got to CMU and everything was falling apart, it was my intention to build that state-of-the-art facility. Bob helped me. We found the materials. I went to the companies and we began to build it. But again, there was no money. Next slide. So Ron came in to help build. And next slide. And I taught the class. Since there was no furnace or one little furnace, many of the students helped build this continuous feed furnace. Next slide. Ron was still in clay, but when he came in the door to help me, he started thinking about how he could approach glass. And he had this idea, which I blew the form for, and he was a real sports person, found this basketball with molten on and we figured out how to get it inside. Next slide.
Is it still a secret to this day?
No. Well, he brought the basketball home. We deflated it. I calipered it, and then I made a vessel that had that calibration at the top.
Uh-huh.
And then we slid it in, and then the tricky part was, how do you blow it up when you get it inside?
Right.
Yeah, but
That
we
part,
did.
That's
We
very
figured
cool.
it out. Yeah. So this really was state of the art. And you could see again, Ron in the background, still working on something back there. My students, I thought, were extremely creative. They were making things way outside the box. They were art students, and I wanted them to apply the same kind of thinking and intellectual rigor that they used in their other classes in glass, even though it was a brand new material. Next slide. This was part of an installation by the woman you saw before, Jenny. Next slide. This is Darian, who created Homage to George Sand. Next slide. So the students came in with whatever skills they had to help build. Next slide. And learn as they went how to build their own studios. And Barbara, in the white sort of hat shape, she went on to build her own studio and still works to this day. Next slide. So we had a lot of Coke bottles from the Jan Sandwies and Boris Tuchenko had run the program beforehand, and they were using bottle glass to melt with flux. Well, we had a lot of bottles left because I wasn't going in that direction. I wanted to have good glass in the furnaces. So the students started using them to slump. Next slide. And slump. Next slide. Then I wrote grants to the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts. I brought in artists for a week at a time. James Carpenter here, next slide. Paul Marioni for casting. I tried to pick artists that use the material in different ways. Next slide. And Dale Chihuly and Billy Morris. Next slide. I opened the sessions to the public. This had never been done before. But I thought the Pennsylvania Council on the Arts deserved a very open and full process, and that's what we did. It was unusual and it was perfect. And I think it planted the seed, not only in me, but in the Pennsylvania Council, that this might be something that could move into the larger city itself. Next slide. You know, they came to me, and I've learned a lot in the process, Pennsylvania Council, because our first feeling was no, especially Ron. No, we cannot build this out in the community. No, we're two artists. We cannot do this. But I asked the question, how? And I think how might lead to maybe, and maybe might lead to yes. Next slide. We were still in our own studio at home because I had left Carnegie Mellon. Carnegie Mellon, after so many years of running the glass furnaces in 1989, I was there from 76 to 89, decided instead of rebuilding, they would just shut it down. So I left teaching at that time. And Ron said, you know what? We can do this in our own studio. So we started working as we were building to get this done. And that is the beginning of making my spinners, where I've made a cone in sand, and we're walking up the steps and standing on pads to blow into that sand mold. Next slide. I had a board of directors by that time. We were convinced. Well, we weren't convinced, but one night I woke up in the middle of the night and I turned to Ron and I said, Ron, if we do this, this will happen. Because they had come to us and said, there's no other glass artist in Pittsburgh. You know, we know you could do it. You've done all this other work. So we set up with a board and a board of directors and committees. And our committee was looking all over town for a building, except an architect friend called and said, I think I have your building. And we went to visit it, Ron and I, on a Saturday morning. There was no lock on the door. The director of the community organization picked the little lock, the little slide lock, and opened the door up. And I walked inside, and I realized that I had been in that building in 1976. And I knew at that point that that building could be a really cool place for glass. It was the East End Food Co-op. And at that point, I was a vegetarian. So I was digging out grain, and I could feel I forgot the building, but when I walked inside, there it was. So I grabbed my blowpipe, ran to the outside of the building and said, take this picture. Next slide. I had great help along the way. Bill Block was a glass collector. He opened up a lot of doors for me. In the beginning, I was quite shy about telling the story, but he would put me in front of people at the Hillman Foundation and R.K. Mellon Foundation and the Heinz Foundation. He would just send me there, and I would go and tell the story. Next slide. And he fed us, by the way. This is the mayor of Pittsburgh. He was absolutely essential in helping us buy the building and also buy the artist house next door, which again, I was told no, but we got to maybe and we got to yes. Next slide. And this is the development of the Glass Center. Next slide. We had to rip through the side of the building and expand it so we could have enough room for furnaces. Next slide. So how we got here is in 1991, when they pursued us, I began to research and think about it. Well, partly because we were told the money was there, which was a total lie. And I wrote a 28-page case for support and went to the Foundation Center in Pittsburgh and researched all the foundations that I could get money from. And that was pre-Bill Block. And once this idea formed, what I was told by people we presented it to was no one had ever presented a plan in this detail before. But that is me. And Ron always said that about me, that I was a detail person, and I am to the nth degree. Next slide. So we had lots of visits with funders and community organizers while we were building. Next slide. And Elsie Hillman, who's now since gone, was amazing. And she and the mayor on the left showed up for one of our first little glass blowing sessions all by herself. There was no classes at the time. We were just firing up. And actually the mayor said, hey, can I just stop by with my kid? And then right behind him was Elsie Hillman saying, okay, I want to blow some glass. So we did. Next slide. And then Ron, of course, came back in because once we acquired all the equipment that I imagined, and in that case for support, I had developed the classes, developed the vision and the mission, created the gallery, even thought about the first exhibitions, brought in all the equipment I could find for free, including cages to put glass in, furniture. We had to bring in people at first as volunteers and then little by little onto us. So that's Ron helping Chris Clark, who's still there at the Glass Center, figure out how to hook up pipes. Next slide.
It's great that Ron was able to do so much just with his hands and his mind.
Well, that's what the amazing thing was. Ron had never built a house before, right. But when we found that land, he said, you know, I think I could build my own house. He said, I carried bricks for my cousins when I was young.
Yeah.
And he had to figure out everything in the house. I mean, our plumber left and never came back, and Ron finished the plumbing. We hired a friend who was an electrician. Well, really, his electrical start came at Carnegie Mellon because there was no money for Carnegie Mellon's electric. So the electrician who I gave artwork to would come in at 8 o'clock in the morning and show Ron what to do. And then he'd check his work at the end of the day.
That's great.
Yeah, it was very cool.
We all need one of him for sure around here.
I don't have a Ron anymore. Yes.
I know, but
I have lots of surrogate Rons who
Right.
can do a piece of it, but he was amazing.
That's
Next
true.
slide. So the first show we titled Shattering Notions, and it was Robin Stanaway. And she completely blackened the room and illuminated these glass plates that kind of hung Calder-esque. So you felt like you were in this underground, underwater environment. It was extraordinary. Next one. And of course, Ron came back in for the next show titled Artists Crossing Lines. And at that point in Ron's career, he didn't think of himself as working in glass. But I had gathered a group of people, including Ron, who were not from glass at all. Artists in the community working in very different media. And I said, again, like I said to my students at Carnegie Mellon, I want you to think in glass, and nothing is impossible. Next slide. So Ron was opening the cast for Patti Bellingillen's cast glass accordion. And she had sound underneath the chair. When you walked toward the chair, it activated the sound of her grandfather playing the accordion. Next slide. And the black vessels you see in the front are Ron's. And the chandelier of candles that melted exactly to form the word fragile on the floor. This is the work of Carol Kumada. So Ron came to me one day at home. I was doing the dishes and he walked in and said, I know exactly what I'm going to make. And he showed me the log that he had brought home. And I have to say, my first thought was, this is impossible. But we worked for 2 weeks steady, every piece breaking, until the first piece came out. And that piece is in the Carnegie Museum. Next slide. I love this piece. It went to an owner of HP GRP Gallery in New York City, no longer there. But the director from Japan bought that piece and said to Ron that he thought that that piece replaced the air in the room. And it made Ron pretty happy. Next slide. The third show, I invited Jill Reynolds to create the exhibition Matter. Jill is a phenomenal artist with flame working. She created a periodic table of objects, and she is always also mapping relationships. Next slide. This is her DNA of her family, and I love the woman's look of pure joy as she's looking at this piece. Next slide. The fourth show was Nadezhda Genitas, who now is in Australia at Canberra. And she's, again, Ron and I were in to help her make her stockings, which she had in an exhibition. What I love about Nadezh is she must be about 5'2". And she was a joy to work with because it brought back to me all the things that I was told I couldn't do. She could handle glass in such an exquisite way. Next slide. Next slide. And we brought in wonderful artists in the Flame Studio. And there was such a joy I could see in the working of all the students there. Next slide. This is Unsa Choi, and Unsa comes from Rochester and has taught classes there. So actually, when this whole thing developed, it was actually a marvelous experience for me to actually sit in on several of the classes. And each class I sat in on, those people became my long-term friends. Next slide. This is a piece of Unsa's work that she was showing to the students. Next slide. I kept thinking that I could easily make my work and make the Glass Center happen at the same time. That's a bit of a myth. It took quite a while for me to do this. It was about 17 years altogether before Ron and I completely stepped back. My feeling was I couldn't step back until it was truly breathing on its own. It had to be able to sustain itself before I could leave. The woman in red in the middle is Heather Mckelloway. Heather wrote me a letter with Drew, her then boyfriend, and they asked if they could come to the Pittsburgh Glass Center and they would volunteer. And I said, as soon as I could find money for them, I would begin to pay them. And they came. Next slide. Next slide. Heather, still in red, power red, which I love, has been the longest serving director, and in my mind, the best. She's wonderful to work with. And she's continued to create a climate of inclusiveness and love and generosity in all the studios with everyone that works there. Next slide. Ron was there for every part of the building, but luckily we did not have to build it. Mark Gibault came in to create the building. And again, Ron and I had both researched as much of the building as we could possibly do, including Ron flying out on our frequent flyer miles to Alberta, Canada, to visit Mark and say, yes, he was the one who could build it to our specifications. Our glory holes or reheating chambers work pneumatically, so you don't need several people scurrying around and opening up a door. We think, Ron and I, that it made it easier for people to work in glass. Next slide. So when I went to funders, and we raised about $4 million to make this happen, I would say, imagine a time in the not too distant future where glass artists come from all over the world. And we have people like Dale Chihuly and Lino Tagliapietro working at the Glass Center and bringing many people to see Pittsburgh. In the end, we had someone who tracked money said that the Year of Glass, which is what we turned it into in 2007, raised over $20 million for the city revenue. And here's Dale Chihuly making a form that he donated to the Glass Center. Next slide. Next slide. We brought in Thurman Statham at the same time, and Thurman worked with local children's groups. And even though we had a policy that no one could be under 16, Thurman, that doesn't matter to him. He brought in kids that were anywhere from like 6 to 7, 8, and got them to think in glass as a group. So he built team building exercises, and he brought in fabulous people to help. Next slide. And they would make these group portraits. And it's exactly what Ron and I wanted to see at this Glass Center, because we put it at a pivot point of different stratas and different demographics, so that if you pointed in one direction it was Chinese, it was Ethiopian, it was African American, and it was also white. But when we turned the corner that first day with me holding up that pipe, I realized that even though that street had gone to sleep, and yes, there were condemned buildings and streetwalkers and tough stuff, I knew when I turned that corner that people took care of their houses, and this street had just gone to sleep, and we could wake it up with art. We could make it wake up with glass. And we did. Next slide. Here's a more recent time when Lino came back to standing room only, all the way down into the back hallway. They could barely see what was going on, but they were there to see this master. And I feel like I came full circle from seeing Lino and being with him then in 1989, and then having him come back. Next slide. I love nature. I love biking. I love walking in the woods, but of course, anything to do with water. Next slide. Back at Alfred, I had forgotten when I began to make this new drop series that I have behind me and behind Aaron, that I had worked with drops many times before. This particular piece was a drop installation on the landscape, but I also made a small drop piece that was purchased by the Corning Museum on an 18-inch by 18-inch bent glass sheet, because our annealers were not very big at Alfred at that time. Next slide. Next slide. Next slide. Now I'm working at the Pittsburgh Glass Center to make the drop. And I think, as I said in the slide, I've come back to glass, to that most primal moment. And I think it's everything that came before is in that drop for me. Next slide. And it's just touching an acid etched piece of glass. And I think, in the beginning, most people didn't get that. They'd look at the etched part and they'd think, well, that should be turned over so it's shiny on the front. And I would think, no, that etching, that soft etching is like a skin for me. It's like a surface that holds that drop. I wasn't even thinking about it as a drop of tears, but it is tender, it is refreshing, it is clearing. And that, I think, is what that means for me. So my first pieces were, they had to have a certain scale which referred to the perfect rectangle. Next slide. And then I went on from there to create these organic shapes. This is an aluminum background with the glass drops. This particular piece is at the Westmoreland Museum in Pennsylvania. Next slide. And this particular piece is somewhat autobiographical in that it's called Building Bridges on a Molecular Level. And I think as I left the Glass Center, I started thinking about, well, Jill Reynolds had said, I know you miss your work, but you are a social sculptor right now. And I understood that. And I think the building process brought this kind of structure into my life. Next slide. So I saw these almost every day, these booms moving and creating triangles. Next slide. Now I'm going to go back a little bit, because before the Glass Center, I was making what I call a spinning top. And I think it refers back to my life as a child in my father's toy store. That's how they watched me. I was on the floor while they were trying to sell the toys. And I think about that top and its relationship to spontaneity and to play. And I think even though I saw this wonderful color that I saw with lino, I took that color but changed it to create this sense of whirling or movement within a form that's now in repose. Next slide. Next slide. Erin. Here we go. Oh, good. And that, yes, that's, well, when I was working with Ron, I set up all of his forms. He really never had a great love for actually blowing glass. For him, it was getting to that big form. So I would set up everything for him so he could take that final gather and get into the wood mold. But at the same time, I was still working with the Glass Center, and this toy appeared. It's a toy form. As I was making Ron's large orbs, these round shapes appeared in my mind. And so this is called No-No, KNOW:*NO. And I kind of think of it as my bad toy or my perky toy or the toy that just goes in its direction. Next slide. And the perfume bottles actually developed while I was looking for funding. To me, these perfume bottles are icons of persuasion. I call them my persuasion series. And in this form, each form had a word etched into the body. And this particular one is surrender. And I think I was telling myself that I had to surrender to this process while it was going on. Next slide. But what I realized too is I was the first woman to run a major glass facility. And then I, along the way, had so many wonderful mentors. And I know artists shouldn't have developed glass centers, but I saw that model in Delchahuli of developing Pilchuck with many people surrounding him. And that's what happened to me. And I've also learned to bring people into my circle. Next slide. This is my team that helps to develop my work. Next slide. This is called the Alchemist's Lament, 8 feet long stainless steel. And this was one of the first pieces that I created in that stainless steel format. Next slide. Yeah, I was trying to think of how to create that swirling motion. And I went through a lot of iterations first. Actually, I put mirror behind the glass first, but that didn't work. Next slide. And these are some of the people that I've moved my work into homes. This is in Florida, St. Petersburg. I almost feel like the people that buy my work, they're really adopting my piece. And if there's ever a moment, if a piece breaks or a drop breaks by whatever, I send them drops in the exact same size so they can fit that back in. It's just part of living with that relationship with them, which rarely ever happens. But if they try to move a piece and someone, you know, I actually had a gallery owner step on a glass drop while I was trying to install. He just forgot where he was standing. So that happens. Not you, Aaron. Wasn't you?
It wasn't me.
Wasn't you. Next slide. And this is the panel before I etch it. I actually designed a very large kiln at the Glass Center, but not for me. It was for Bertil Valine, who I was always hoping would come in and cast one of his boats there. And then it was sitting there. And of course, I worked to the edges of the kiln. Next slide. This is part of the acid etching process. So I get on my hazmat suit And even though I'm outside, I still am completely covered. Next slide. In the beginning, as in the video you saw, I worked with gunmetal patinas to create that kind of brownish or blackish texture. I would paint on the patina, etch the surface, and then rinse it off, wash it, dry it, and then seal it. Next slide. And that's what the surface looks like before I add the glass to it. I tried to create those rich browns in the base of the water that I was traveling through. And West Branch of the Susquehanna was very wide, so I wanted to create that feeling. Next slide.
Were the edges of this painted too? Where usually it's steel? It looks like they're
Yeah.
they were.
Yeah, everything
Gotcha.
is painted.
Gotcha.
Next slide. And this is it with just the panels in place. And the panels are a repeated form that's unified, because that's the best way to get the glass to slump evenly. If I move them too far apart, they don't slump evenly to give me that soft ripple. And these are 3 panels together, so it's a 9-foot frame, 36 inches each. Next slide. So I could actually theoretically build out as long as I want, depending on just building, continuing as units. And this is that same work, Delta, with drops.
Beautiful.
Yeah, thank you. Next slide. And this is actually the first work in stainless called Alchemist Dream. And it's really before I made all the fine detail changes to the tracks. It was a very thin track. Now my edges are recessed, so you can't see any wires at any distance. And each one of them, as you know, the drop is actually suspended. So again, it's like an installation all over again for me, but on the wall. Next slide. And this piece is titled Darlin' Run. It's actually from a trip I took up north on a beautiful passage of the Pine Creek up in Upper PA called the Grand Canyon of the East, but I kind of don't understand that title. But there were lots of beautiful waterfalls, and the area that I rode through was called Darlin' Run. So I wanted to get that real beautiful warmth and real just gentle drops coming down. And I think that's the last slide. So thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen, for sharing that. What a great record of history. I'm going to stop sharing that you shared with us today, and I'm glad I recorded it to have this kind of thing forever, because it goes to show how much effort you put into not only your career, but helping others and creating this entire facility for people to come to this day and beyond. So it is an honor to have you join us and give us this talk today. If anybody has any questions, this will be the time to unmute and to ask, but there will be some works available sent out via email for those who get my emails in our newsletter system. We have Kathleen's work available in the gallery, so come visit and see it live and in person. Kathleen, thank you again for joining us and being part of this today.
You're welcome. I'd like to say one other thing before
Sure.
we leave. The Glass Center is having a gala in September that anyone is invited to. Please look on the website for pittsburghglasscenter.org. And we actually have a wonderful award in Ron's honor, where we select an artist each year to come in for 2 weeks to a month to make work. So there's a possibility to support that as well. But support what they're doing. They're an amazing organization that I'm very proud of. Thanks, Aaron.
You're most welcome. Well, thank you guys, and thanks for joining us today. Yeah, it's incredible work. You must experience it in person. If you haven't, I'm sure many of you may have her work, Kathleen's work already. Do enjoy it and share it with others. Please, if you like this video, please subscribe to it and share this with people who may love it online, and send it out to your friends, because we're getting the word out for the artists that are in our Habitat family and beyond. So thank you again for joining us today, and this will be on YouTube. See y'all next time.
Thank
Bye,
you.
y'all.
Bye.
Take care, everyone. Have a great weekend.
Very nice
Great
presentation.
job, Kathleen.
Thank you. Thanks,
I had
Steve.
no idea about the history of the Pittsburgh Glass Center and that you were so involved.